right, good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for the somewhat late start. Blame it on being from the islands and 95. My name is Dr. Gregory Alfred, and I am going to talk to you today about a test that I think is a very important test, a metabolic breath analysis, and it's the way that we can get a very important number called VO2 max. And arguably, I would say it's one of the most important tests that probably most of you have never been offered by your physician or healthcare provider. And it really gives a lot of useful information. I chose this as my intro slide. Any followers of Predictor Attia might recognize it. He's one of the thought leaders in the longevity space and has really come up with a lot of, I think, very useful frameworks of how to think about health. And he has this paradigm of medicine 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So characterized by the different lines. And he's plotted this graph of lifespan versus health span. So medicine 1.0, which would be medicine up until about the 20th century, didn't really move the needle much on lifespan. Medicine 2.0, which would be our current healthcare system, as we know, has very much a disease focus, symptom control focus. So that has achieved an extension in lifespan, but really hasn't achieved much improvement in health. So that looks like what most of us have recognized in our loved ones in that last decade of life, a significant decline in function. So what we're really shooting for is medicine 3.0, the idea that we can expand both health span and lifespan. Just for some disclosures, so this is informational only, not here to give specific medical advice. And even though I am discussing a specific test that I offer, my clinic, Hyperbaric Medical Solutions, of which I'm the medical director, we do offer this kind of testing. But again, not here to sell it, just here to give you the information. I'm also a board-certified emergency medicine physician and certified in hyperbarics and a proud collaborator with the Biohack Lab. So what I'd like to achieve today in this talk is really just give an overview of what VO2 max is and metabolic breath analysis in general, define it, talk about a lot of the evidence for it, discuss why it matters, and we can target multiple different demographics that would benefit those interested in healthy aging, in performance, weight loss. We'll talk about the logistics of the testing, what a test is like, how to prepare for it, and then we'll wrap it up with reviewing a few reports. So I'd like you to keep in mind, when thinking about any test related to healthcare, there should be certain criteria about that test that you use to determine, is this useful? It should be an accurate test, should be precise, it should be reliable. When you go back and retest, you should be able to trust that number. It should be valid, and that's primarily determined by studies, and there's been lots of validity established for this test. It should be clinically relevant, it should be a practical, feasible test, and lastly, there should be results that you can take action upon. Anyone know what these are? Yes, the famous mitochondria. So a lot of these, people talk about them, the batteries of our cells, the producers of energy, but they are ultimately the main organelles involved in metabolism. Metabolism is us taking the byproducts of food, our macros, and generating oxygen. But they also are really the final endpoint in the oxygen delivery chain. So they use oxygen together with the macros to create our energy. And up until now, there aren't very many tests that can really zero in on metabolic or mitochondrial health or function. So being a hyperbaric oxygen provider, I'm always utilizing oxygen, and it's pretty hard to overstate the importance of oxygen. I mean, we all know that we could only survive a couple minutes without it. And if you can find a way to assess the entire oxygen delivery chain, then you have a way of really understanding so much of our physiology, because oxygen consumption requires healthy lungs, healthy hearts, adequate blood vessels, adequate red blood cells, and ultimately functioning mitochondria. So this is the oxygen delivery chain. We're breathing in 21% oxygen in our environment. That's sufficient to bind with the blood in our vessels in our lungs and gets carried out to the tissues in the mitochondria. Now you might think, wait, we have some tests to assess this chain. And this is the famous pulse oximetry. So because our bodies are so resilient, if we relied on this to determine problems within the oxygen delivery chain, you're way too late in the game. It's at the end. So you really aren't going to see drops in oxygen levels until pretty much significant problems are already established. So why does cardiorespiratory fitness, aka aerobic fitness, as measured by VO2 max, why does it matter? Well, it's really the function of how well our body is taking in oxygen, delivering it, and utilizing it. So again, it's a reflection of multiple organ systems, and having a tool that can really assess its overall function is very useful. So what is VO2 max? So it's really the maximum rate at which a person can use oxygen. It's usually measured during exercise at peak effort, and it's expressed as a volume of oxygen that a person can use per kilogram of body weight per minute. In a simple way, you should think of it as the size of your engine, your aerobic engine. So physiologically, what is it telling us? Again, back to that chain. It's telling you how quickly you can take oxygen in from the environment, pump it out into your vascular system to the muscles, and then have your muscles utilize it in the metabolic processes that we need to move us. So what determines VO2 max? Well, there's two sides of the coin. There's the supply side and the demand side. So oxygen supply is primarily determined by health of our lungs, health of our heart, how much red blood cells we have, the health of our vascular supply. And on the demand side, it's really the mitochondria which are going to be creating that demand. So they're the rate limiting step. And we know, I'm sure a lot of us have heard about this epidemic of metabolic disease amongst the U.S. population. At last study, they say over 90% of the U.S. population has some degree of metabolic unhealth. So again, it underlines the importance of finding a tool to assess this. So we know that the body has this incredible capacity for adaptation. So sitting here listening to me, you're probably consuming about 300 milliliters of oxygen. If you were to get up and start walking around, that number starts to increase when you're jogging, maybe about 2 liters. Faster run, 3 liters. If you start to run a hill at max effort, you're going to start to cap out at around 4,000 to 5,000 milliliters. So eventually you're going to plateau. No matter how hard you keep trying, you can't consume and use more oxygen. So that's the limit of your aerobic engine, and that is the VO2 max. Now, when you hit that plateau, you could still go a little faster, but you are no longer using oxygen. Now you're in anaerobic metabolism, aka sprinting, so there's a limit to how far you can go. So VO2 max is not an indicator of how fast you're going to go, but it's more the size of this engine. So what are some numbers that would put this into context? So someone who's very sedentary, doesn't train at all, they're usually going to have a VO2 max below 30, and that person is not going to be able to run up the hill. Someone who doesn't work out but is otherwise healthy, the range is between 25 to 40. In general, females have lower VO2 max, and that's only because of average muscle mass size. When you get into the elite endurance athlete, that's where you see the highest numbers. So above 65 is common. When you get into the elite of the elite, like Tour de France riders, we're talking 80. The world record is 97.5 in a cyclist. In the animal kingdom, we think of endurance animals. Alaskan Iditarod sled dogs, they have 3 times what a human can produce. So these are the current world record holders, and you'll see these are pretty much all endurance athletes. Interestingly enough, most of them are Norwegian, which I'm pleased because my mother is from Norway, so maybe I inherited some of these genes. But most of us are not aspiring to be elite endurance athletes. So does this have relevance for us? And obviously the answer is yes. And there have been plenty of studies that have really elucidated this. In 2018, JAMA put out a study looking at over 120,000 people, and they found this direct correlation. So they tested their VO2 max and then followed them for years, assessing mortality. And they found that those with the highest VO2 max had the lowest all-cause mortality. So let's drill down a bit. Those with just below average VO2 max, so they were in the 25 to 50% category per age, they had a 100% increased risk of death from all causes. So when you compare that to something like smoking, we all know how harmful smoking is. Smoking gives you about a 40% increased risk of all-cause mortality. So really, a poor cardiorespiratory fitness carries even a greater relative risk of mortality than smoking. Not to say that you should continue smoking and just exercise, of course, but it really underlines the importance of cardiorespiratory fitness. And what's encouraging is just moving from the bottom quarter to the second quarter in this study decreased the risk of death by 50%. And this number keeps going up. The people in the elite category were 5 times less likely to die than the ones at the bottom. Another study, even larger one, compiling over 2 million subjects, which is huge, found the same thing, this relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness, aka VO2 max, and your risk of dying. The American Heart Association has come out with a pretty strong statement in 2016, basically calling VO2 max the strongest predictor for how long you're going to live, but not only how long, but also how well you're going to live. So in this clinical statement, they made the recommendation that people should know their VO2 max, that they should be testing it on a regular basis. Again, going back to that health span versus lifespan discussion, VO2 max not only predicts the length of our lives, but more importantly, how well we function. So Peter Attia, again, has this really cool concept of the centenarian decathlon. It's this idea that you take your last decade of life and you try and identify all the things that you want to do, whether it's travel and carry your own luggage, lift up your grandchildren, go for walks, all these things. So in order to be able to do that when we're 80 or 90, we have to train to get our numbers up now, because as we age, with each year on average, VO2 max drops by 1%. So we can backcast, we can predict where we should be now in order to get where we want to be later. These are some numbers. So yeah, I would love, when I have grandchildren, I would love to be able to play soccer with my grandkids. So that requires a VO2 max of 35, 40. Walking upstairs about the same, hiking around 30. If I want to surf in my 80s, I'd probably need a VO2 max that's pretty significant. So again, we can identify, we have benchmarks then. So for a man, I'm in my 50s, I want my VO2 max to stay above 45 because I know that that is what's going to portend well for the future. Now, how do you train to improve your cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max? Well, a lot of people, just kind of think, all right, I'm going to do my 3-4 days a week in the gym and exercise, and not really with a lot of precision. And we know that in order to expand, improve our aerobic engine, we need to not only train for the peaks, so the peak would be zone 4 and 5. So for those of, I'm sure most of you know about these heart rate zones. They can be determined by age. You can take 220 minus your age, and that gives you a max heart rate. And then based on that, based on your age, you've got the different zones, 1 through 5. But a lot of us, myself included, when we exercise, we're often spending a lot of time in zone 4 and zone 5, and maybe not really spending the proper amount of time in zone 2. And that should really be thought of like a pyramid. That should be the base for your endurance. And so you really need to not only work on the peak, but also expand the base. And arguably, you should spend the majority of your time when you're doing cardio, I'm not talking about weights, should be done while in zone 2. What are some other ways you can improve your cardiorespiratory fitness? Of course, I'm going to put in a plug for hyperbaric oxygen. There was a cool study out of Israel that demonstrated treating people in their 60s for 12 weeks of hyperbarics increased VO2 max on average by 4 to 5 points, and this was without any training program. So there's things like exercise with oxygen. So the lab has an amazing device, VO2, which can simulate altitude training, an amazing way of improving your cardiorespiratory fitness. Of course, the other pillars matter. Nutrition and your macronutrient composition matters. Certain supplements can certainly improve both circulation and mitochondrial function. And then when you're, really in the optimization zone, things like peptides, etc. So how do we measure VO2 max? So there are some formulas to calculate it, but the gold standard is something called indirect calorimetry. So this used to require quite a lot of equipment. So usually done in an exercise physiology lab with what's known as a metabolic cart, which has several computers and sensors, and you're usually on a graded treadmill and you perform the test. So up until probably 5 years ago, this was something that it was pretty hard to access. But now, 2025, we've got, thanks to technology, everything becomes smaller, quicker, faster. And this is the device that I use. It's charging there in the corner. It's called the PNOE device, but there's others on the market. So this involves a mask with a sensor. You have to wear a heart strap. And then you exercise either on a treadmill or on a bike, and you just need a smartphone, and that's all you need for the test. So this has now become accessible, feasible, practical. This is our location in Miami. We primarily do the test either on a treadmill or on an assault bike. I prefer the assault bike because it engages both upper and lower bodies, so you get a little more of an accurate number. In general, if someone is a runner, we have them do the treadmill. If they're a cyclist, obviously on the assault bike. If they don't have a preference, I usually have them on the assault bike. Interestingly enough, people who don't regularly exercise, if you just put them on it, and they're not, especially not runners, you put them on a treadmill, their heart rates tend to be much higher. So you are going to get kind of a oftentimes 10% higher number if you just put them on a treadmill as opposed to a bike. This is a test in action. So you wear a little backpack that's connected to the sensor, and you're wearing a mask. There's a heart rate strap on, and then I've got the device monitoring the results. So pretty low infrastructure needs. So the basic principles, this is the mask and that's the sensor. It's really just measuring three things which then go on to give us a wealth of information. So it's measuring the flow of air in and out. It's measuring the amount of oxygen consumed and the amount of CO2 produced. So just from those three things, we can generate over 23 different biomarkers that are, again, going to give us a great assessment of the overall oxygen delivery chain. We can assess heart function, lung function, vascular function, mitochondrial function. So it's pretty impressive that you can just use a relatively simple tool to get all this information. One thing that's unique to specifically metabolic breath analysis, so to do a VO2 max test, all you really need to do is track oxygen. You don't have to track CO2. But when you combine CO2 calculations, then you get much more information about fuel partitioning, understanding what your body is oxidizing for energy at that point in time. And it produces a number called the RER, respiratory exchange ratio. So at rest, if you're relatively fasted 3 or 4 hours without food, you should be burning mostly fat, and that creates a RER of 0.7. As you start to increase your activity level, you gradually start to burn more carbohydrates. Certainly once you're past zone 3 and 4, you tend to be exclusively carbohydrates, and that's an RER of 1. So just that number has so much relevance, but one of the obvious ones is that people who are metabolically flexible. So that means they can easily switch between the most readily available fuel. You want metabolic flexibility. So RER can give you a snapshot of what is your metabolic flexibility. You should have at rest, like I said, closer to 0.7. If you are at rest 0.8 or higher, by definition, you have poor metabolic flexibility. What does that mean? Higher risk for weight gain, higher risk for insulin resistance, a very significant predictor of how successful you're going to be with weight loss. So why would this matter for wellness, for longevity? Well, there's lots of parameters that it can give us, and we'll run through some of them. So this particular company has generated an algorithm to create something called a biologic age, compare that to their chronologic age. So we obviously all want to be younger than what our driver's license says. And again, this has been validated by the American Heart Association as probably the most important predictor of your biologic age. So a great metric snapshot to see where you are in time currently. It can help identify chronic disease. So many of the most potent chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, lung disease, metabolic disease in the form of diabetes. So by being able to identify issues along this oxygen delivery chain, you could, in theory, catch things much earlier in the process and intervene. So the right caloric deficit is very important for maintaining a healthy weight. So a very common problem that people make, especially when they do crash diets, is they drastically decrease the amount of calories they're taking in. And really, once you get below 750 calories, it's almost too big of a deficit for most people, and that results in a metabolic slowing, which in turn results in low energy, chronic hunger, and plateau and weight loss. And we hear this all the time. People say, but I work out all the time and I can't lose weight. This is a big part of why. And so by testing someone, understanding their metabolic rate, you can precisely say for that individual, okay, these are your caloric needs on days that you exercise. These are your caloric needs on days that you don't. And by following that more precise prescription, you're going to be way more successful in maintaining a healthy weight. Another great thing about this particular platform is it can help identify where do you need to focus in your training. Do you need to focus on more endurance and cardio training, again, primarily in zone 2 to increase that VO2 max in the base? Do you need to focus more on resistance training because the larger the muscle mass, the healthier you are metabolically? Or do you need to focus on interval training? So it's another great tool. And again, so these, by knowing your specific training zones can really matter. So oftentimes when I'm doing HIIT or different workouts, I'm usually zone 4, zone 5. And you know, that can be very useful, but if my goal is to burn fat, I'm primarily burning carbs in those zones. So we really, zone 2 and zone 3 are really where most people are burning the majority of their fat. So again, that should be the target. If body composition, weight loss is the target, you know you need to increase your time spent in zone 2. So this test can give you precise numbers as to where you are. Another thing it can assess is just your overall breathing. So most of us don't breathe well enough. I hear everyone taking deep breaths.
And posture.
That's right. So, you know, we're all on our devices, on our screens, just shallow kind of hyperventilation. And chronically hyperventilating will drop your CO2. Low CO2 impairs how well you deliver oxygen. So an ideal breath pattern is actually breathing as few as 6 times per minute. So there's a nice pattern called coherence breathing where you can breathe in for 6 seconds and breathe out for 6 seconds. And it's not intuitive, but it takes practice and training, and hence the benefits of breath work. But that's, again, something that can be identified with this test. So here's a kind of overview video of what it's like to do the test. The volume's not that important, really. So there's 2 components to the test. There is a resting test where you put on the mask, put on the heart rate monitor, and you just chill for about 10 minutes and breathe normally. And this is where a lot of those metrics are accumulated: respiratory rate, metabolic rate, RER, all these different things. And then after that, we move on to the exercise portion, and this is where we can calculate VO2 max. So it's a graded test. You start out and warm up for 1 to 3 minutes, and then gradually in the active phase, every minute you're increasing, either on the treadmill you're increasing speed, on the bike you're increasing watts, until you, ideally until you get to fatigue. Normally to get enough data, we want a minimum of about 9 minutes in the exercise phase. And then there's a warm down, and that's very important because that determines how quickly you recover, and also a very important metric. These are some of the things that you should do before a test. Ideally, you're fasting, mostly for the resting test. We don't want stimulants, caffeine, tobacco, alcohol on board. Probably should abstain from intense exercise because that can throw off some of the numbers for the 24 hours before the test, but not a lot to prep for. As far as what a report looks like, so the reports are about 15 pages long. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just going to kind of explain a few things. So this is a client I recently tested, and this was her resting test. And you can see the resting report gives you 7 categories based on, or 8 categories based on those 23 biomarkers that are obtained. And you know, you can then identify where does someone need to focus. And on her resting test, really the biggest limitation was in this balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, the whole, you know, fight or flight or rest and digest, which is very common for many of us. And this is determined both through looking at HRV as well as looking at your breathing patterns. So when you're breathing into the full lungs, your vagal nerve is stimulated. But if you're breathing shallow, you're not going to be getting that same parasympathetic nervous system tone. And this is very important just for overall cardiovascular resilience and stress management. We also, again, got her specific caloric balance. So based on this test, now she knows on days that she's working out exactly how many calories she needs to consume. On her rest days, exactly how many calories she needs to consume. So again, it becomes a much more precise way as opposed to the often haphazard way we go about trying to obtain caloric balance. As far as the active test, again, we get a bunch of different parameters. There's 9 on the active test. And the one that everyone wants to run to is to look at their biologic age, and she was biologically 11 years younger than her chronologic age, which is great. And, but her metabolic flexibility wasn't great. So what's great about this report is it's going to outline what are ways to improve that. And in her case, exercise is a part of every prescription, but the specific exercise for her that's probably going to move the needle the most is resistance training, followed by endurance, followed by interval. And we also get recommendations for nutrition and lifestyle as well. So great test with just about 30 minutes time commitment, giving you a wealth of information. And there are a common question that comes up is, do you have to test? Can you estimate it? And yes, there's a bunch of different ways of doing it you can find on the internet. And an easy one is something called the METS method. So a lot of treadmills, elliptical, stair climbers will give you a readout of METS. And once you figure out how many METS you can sustain for a minute at max effort, you would multiply that by 3.5, and that's going to be a rough estimate for VO2 max. So you don't have to do a test using breath analysis. So again, going back to this framework, what makes a test reliable, useful, helpful? It's all these things, and I believe that this test really checks all those boxes. It's very precise, very accurate. It's very reliable. It's been clinically validated. It's relevant. It's practical now, and it gives you information that you can then turn and do something about. I'll close with this slide. This is one of my favorite images in general, the idea of the tree of life. It's this great metaphor for health. So, it's very tempting to say, let's work on the leaves, work on the appearance, because that's what's good for the gram. But ultimately, what matters is the health of the foundations, the soil, the roots. And what comprises that? It's the lifestyle foundations. And exercise is arguably one of the most potent roots of all. So, hopefully now you have a little better understanding of the test and how you can use it, and hopefully you'll start to incorporate that. So that's all I got. Any questions?
So with Zone 2 versus Zone 3 training,
Yeah.
Zone 3 is often regarded by athletes as junk training. And I'm curious because the curve of fat burn actually covers most of Zone 3 at peak, which would be wonderful.
Well, that, just so you know,
wonderful
that
because that's unfortunately where I spend most of my time. It's really hard to stay in Zone 2.
It
You
is.
have to be crawling.
It is. And, in theory, that's going to get better with more fitness. But that particular graph is not everybody, right? So there's going to be people at different stages of the continuum, which is why it's useful to test to see, okay, well, where am I really targeting fat oxidation the most? But yeah, you're right. I mean, it does speak to why I think people get frustrated with exercise, because they put in the time and they're not necessarily seeing the needle being moved, and I think it's in large part because we're not spending enough time in those lower zones.
Yeah. And then for increasing VO2 max, do you have a preference between things like Norwegian 4x4s, which is Zone 4, and all out for a minute or two max, which is Zone 5?
Right. No, most of
And actually, sorry if I could, just like really hitting that top end, like going to absolute maximum heart rate.
Yeah, most of the protocols for trying to raise it are going to be alternating, getting up to Zone 4 or 5, period of rest, going back up, period of rest. So there's, a wealth of different protocols. I haven't seen any one that is standing out more than others, but the concept is getting up to those highest zones, recovering for a minute or two, and then going back up. And that could be done in the form of hills or sprints or whatever it is. But again, without establishing that base of Zone 2, it's going to be limited.
Right.
So
And
the
then
two have to be done
last
together.
one from me is relating to age. My understanding is that you lose about 4.25 milliliters per minute per decade. Is that about right? And did you have an age-related chart up there?
Yeah, so
Because I've been curious what's elite 4 different age groups?
So there's different what are called nomograms, which plot it against age, and you can find those all over the place. It's on average, VO2 max will decrease by 1% per year, and then per decade that can calculate out, and that's average, of course. And so you clearly want to keep that as flat a rate of decline as possible. But yeah, as far as what would be considered elite, so for a man, put you on the spot, how old are you?
59.
All right, so 59, so yeah.
VO2 max is 51.
Perfect, so you are considered elite when compared to your age-related peers. So keep it up. Yes?
So I just did an experiment, and I spent 12 days. I spent 12 days in a hyperbaric chamber, 1.5 hour a day, a 1.5 ATA, and I've seen a 6% increase in my VO2 max. But I wonder.
No change in your training regimen?
No. So same, 5 days a week.
That was the only variable.
Yeah, so I kept everything else the same. But I wonder if there is any. So if you Google how to increase VO2 max, you run into different articles, people doing different like kettlebells without breathing, for like a couple of 60 seconds. Is there any kind of shortcut besides what you just showed earlier to? And if you increase it as a result of the hyperbaric, for example, is the new baseline going to stay high? You're going to drop back if you stop?
So as far to answer the first part, I'm not aware of any unique hack. There are some interesting ways to cheat the test. So interestingly enough, if you hold your breath right as you're about fatiguing and 4 or 5 seconds of breath hold, then your VO2 max shoots up right after that. And it typically is not sustained, so in a good test that's really measuring like the overall, it's not just going to capture that peak, but that's kind of a way to cheat on the test, so to speak, because it's not really reflecting that your cardiorespiratory fitness has now increased that much. It's just that you've created in that short period of time this huge oxygen demand by holding your breath, and then when you start breathing again, the consumption, it's just like you create a vacuum for oxygen. But I think it's tempting to try and find hacks. We're in the biohack lab, but ultimately, it's just consistent work. You can certainly fine-tune things, and it's always going to be individual. It's hard to find this one. If everyone did this exercise, whether it's kettlebells in a cryo chamber or whatever, it's not gonna apply to everybody.
I think it's worth noting that one of the best ways to bring your VO2 max up is to lose weight.
Absolutely. No, I did include that on some of the factors. Yeah, it's just a formula. Absolutely. Yes, because it's per kilogram. So yes, absolutely. Some people I've known before their test, they're cutting back significantly to try and drop 5 pounds because that will mean that their number is going to be better. But what really matters is the general trajectory, the arc over time, not these little minute fluctuations, in my opinion. Yes, sir.
2 questions. One is, what is the cost? And then how frequent? You mentioned the arc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at our center, we charge $300 for the test, for both tests. And the American Heart Association, in their recommendation, said annual. I think as the test becomes more accessible, you can do it more frequently than that. I typically tell my clients every 3 to 6 months to make sure. And a lot of it depends on if you've done an intervention and you want to see, is the intervention moving the needle in the way you want, then you go back and test. If you're happy with where things are at, you wouldn't necessarily have to test as frequently. That's the concept, yeah. But the AHA says annually. Yes, sir.
So do we have to drive to Miami, or do you do that here?
Well,
You have a more elaborate system in Miami, but that's...
No, that's what's beautiful about this, is it's extremely portable. In fact, today, if there's anybody that wants to do a resting test, I can probably test a few people. Again, it's 10 minutes and breathing. Ideally, you shouldn't have eaten for the last 3 hours and no caffeine for the last couple hours, so, you know, that may exclude a lot of people, but, yeah, so, but yeah, we are going to start offering it here, to answer your question.
Okay.
Yep.
And lastly, if you've been in the care of a cardiologist and you've already had a stress test,
Yes,
is that a component of a typical cardio stress test?
should be.
Should be?
It should be, but it's not, no. No, so with a stress test, they're not doing any breath analysis.
Okay.
A stress test, they're just monitoring your heart with a
Okay.
12 lead EKG while you increase your effort
Because
sometimes.
I've had that done, and I was hoping I could refer back to the results. but
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember the math.
No, they don't. They don't do breath analysis during the
Thank-
stress test, yeah.
How long is the other test?
The active test ends up being the time on either the treadmill or the bike is about 12 minutes. Yeah, so it ends up being like about a 20-minute experience. So the two tests together, I usually tell people 30, 40 minutes to get them both done.
You didn't tell them how much fun it is.
Oh, yeah. The exercise test is, yeah, if you do it correctly. So I've had some people who kind of lollygag, and then at the end, all of a sudden, they're showing me all this effort. I'm like, wait, where was this the whole time? So, yeah, I mean, the point is to take you to max effort. And like anything, when you're working out, whether it's max weight or max effort, it's going to hurt. But the cliche, no pain, no gain. So,
How about for results?
as far as?
You're just like analyzing in order to get the results.
The timing.